Drinking and alcohol's cause of corruption of society and crime ruined families, people, took lives, and prevented the progress of U.S. society. The solution seemed obvious: prohibit the manufacture, transportation, exportation, and sale of intoxicating beverages. Prior to Prohibition, drinking had become a major part and problem of U.S. life. Even with select states having already implemented bans on alcohol, the annual per capita consumption of alcohol in the years prior to Prohibition, 1905 to 1910, was a significant 2.4 gallons. Searching for a solution to these problems, the temperance movement emerged out of the age of antebellum's social activism. Although Prohibition was developed with solid intentions of eliminating alcohol to help combat public disobedience and social problems, the ineffectiveness of enforcing Prohibition regulations and the unintended consequence of organized crime led to the eventual repeal of the 18th Amendment.
The temperance movement that resulted in Prohibition had its foundation in strong morals, seeking to progress society forward by eliminating alcohol. According to leading temperance activist Cora Stoddard, the implementation of Prohibition would decrease rates of child abuse, mortality, hospitalization, domestic violence, and crime.
Prohibition was also built on hard statistics. As stated in 1910, the per capita consumption of alcohol was 2.4 gallons, but in 1830, the nation's highest per capita alcohol consumption rate was at 7.1 gallons per year. While these statistics are representative of a period nearly a century before the passing of the 18th Amendment, Prohibition was not an isolated incident, but the accumulation of temperance support.
The first organized temperance movements appeared in the 1820s. The temperance movement derived from the outburst of social change during the age of antebellum and the Second Great Awakening. During these periods, a middle class emerged, and many of those with extra time and money turned to social activism. The strong connection to religion and the relationship temperance had with the financially capable activists created a strongly motivated movement. This allowed a low percentage of the population to have an influence that outweighed the majority. Blinded by their devotion, temperance supporters were willing to give up freedoms with the hope that the problems alcohol caused would be resolved. Thus, the empowered temperance groups got their way as national prohibition was lobbied and voted into national legislation on January 16, 1919, and took effect on January 17, 1920.
Suddenly and completely, Prohibition was instituted with its definitive regulations needing to be enforced. National prohibition had been eased upon the public by state temperance laws and practiced during World War I during the temporary wartime prohibition implemented during the war to save grain. However, the passing of the 18th Amendment demanded an immediate allocation of government to facilitate and enforce Prohibition. In response, the Volstead Act was passed that allowed for the policing of the 18th Amendment and established the Bureau of Prohibition. The sudden creation of the well-funded and powerful government agency caused it to have weak ties with the communities and other government agencies. The new bureau was thus susceptible to corruption. Officers took advantage of their jobs by accepting bribes, graft, and protection payoffs. In New York, stories of agents' antics and corruption glorified the job. Prohibition sleuth Izzy Einstein gained legendary status with his creative uses of disguises from fishermen to opera singers. Capitalizing upon his fame, Izzy published a book on his adventures as an agent. Busts were timed by officers to receive maximum media attention to accrue fame. Many Prohibition officers, such as Izzy, did not even carry a gun. The volatile agency was poorly regulated and thus manipulated for personal benefit. On the other end of the spectrum, Prohibition officers easily overstepped their boundaries and abused their powers. Warrants were able to be issued on very low grounds of belief, and thus overissued in violation of constitutional rights. Other times, agents were improperly trained or overly aggressive, and the consequences fell upon the public. Bradley Bowling, a small-time moonshiner who ran away while in possession of a half-gallon of whiskey, was shot to death while unarmed. Furthermore, officers targeted certain regions, races, ethnicities, and classes, openly acknowledging that violators received different treatment based on these traits. These rifts created tensions between the public and police forces. Corruption ruined the foundation on which enforcement was to be built.
The uncaring attitude of enforcement in the public degraded the legitimacy of Prohibition and its effectiveness. This uncaring attitude was popularized by the media. Catering to viewership that was a majority anti-Prohibition, media sources cast the Prohibition as something that was not to be taken seriously. The magazine The Smart Set referred to the Prohibition as a thing no civilized man goes dry because of, a symbol of the snouting and repression that now characterized life. During Prohibition, America as a whole never took Prohibition seriously, until it had matured in the early 30s, and by then it was too late. Prohibition was fundamentally flawed, as the U.S. aimed for the impossible goal of complete nationwide prohibition, a goal that overlooked potential problems the ban on alcohol would have, such as closing saloons and cutting into restaurants' income. The consequence of this was increased unemployment rates, not a decline in unemployment as desired. Furthermore, prohibition created an offense that many Americans would violate by buying alcohol, and thus many more people became subject to being arrested, contradicting the goal of lightening the burden of crime. In 1919, the last pre-Volstead year, there were 4,600,860 arrests made. By the second Volstead year, there were nearly 2 million more arrests at 6,339,260. The jails were filled with low-profile violators. In this legal system, prosecuting important people was very difficult. However, influential or wealthy violators who needed to be apprehended caused a commotion in the media and court systems, making them much harder to convict. The Lamontagne brothers, whose wealth allowed them to employ elite lawyers, and brought media attention to the case as it is apparent with the article in the Literary Digest, helped them walk away from a serious conviction of bootlegging with only a fine.
The inability to regulate and enforce large-scale prohibition against violators and organized crime with a corrupt policing force led to the demise of prohibition. Of course, it was expected that people would disobey this new law, and the police would be ready to enforce it and make arrests if necessary. What was never predicted was the gang involvement in these crimes that was born out of hunger for money and the accepting of violence in cities like Chicago, Boston, and New York.
Notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone admitted that he sold illegal alcohol as a public service because the demand was so high, making him a hero. Capone's friend in Chicago, Raphael, owned a store, and due to Al, when the prohibition went into effect, the store had a steady stream of Italian housewives who came to buy the increasing variety of so-called imported foods that were really supplies used to make illegal alcoholic beverages. Capone was widely adored for his service to the people because he sold alcohol to stores and personal purchases, but this made them ignore his other criminal activities which covered Chicago's streets in blood and made it harder to put him to justice.
The power-hungry Al Capone gained a dangerous monopoly over the alcohol industry during Prohibition. With crime organized into a single coalition, gangs had the combined resources to pay off politicians and police figures. Because of the lack of money in politics, politicians began to look towards other sources of income and fell to the influence of the gangs.
Of course, organized crime wasn't limited to Chicago. In Boston, a less notorious criminal named Charles Solomon ran the streets. Charles Solomon was known as Boston's Capone, and he was the notorious king of illegal booze. Even though he heard rumors of the authorities being onto him, he was calm because no one in or out of the law dared to mess with him. There were people who adored Solomon and those who hated him, prohibitionists and anti-prohibitionists. The night before Solomon was supposed to attend federal court for his crimes, he decided to celebrate his legacy of illegal booze at another club in Boston called the Cotton Club. That night, he was shot and killed by other gang members in the bathroom of the club, highlighting the brutality and passion that filled people in the legal alcohol industry. Another way the men whose salaries relied on the selling of alcohol were able to keep making money off it was by bootlegging.
When collecting evidence of illegal stills, Lloyd Jester, a prohibition agent, said that people would walk in and out of stores for stills with 5-gallon cans. These 5-gallon cans were used to haul the alcohol or the produce out. From the start of Prohibition, organized crime was always on the rise, so by 1929, even the average citizen could be heavily involved. Police affiliation allowed gang members to confidently do as they pleased without worry of being arrested. Prosecution of violators created a citizens versus police effect, pushing people to lash out into criminal action in response to these unfavorable convictions.
By 1930, the 18th Amendment was on its last legs. Although the government's repeal of the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment gave in to the people's demands, it seemed useless and disappointing for most Americans. The time for spending extra money on booze and gambling had passed with the start of the Depression. What began as a deep appreciation for Al Capone's service to the public of Chicago transformed into resentment for how he lived the high life. Prohibition was repealed on December 3, 1933. Clubs were opened as the repeal took place, and almost all states ratified the repeal. The night before the repeal, authorities raided the Vanity Fair Club on Newbury Street in Boston 6 times that night. They couldn't find anyone guilty of drinking, but when the authorities left, the drinking started again.
The repeal of Prohibition was more than just a reinstatement of alcohol in America. It was the end of an era of bloodshed and tragic economic depression. This was an era where the people knew the needs of the country better than the government. Despite the pure intentions for Prohibition, it was nearly impossible to enforce, a huge gap for organized crime to fill. The government never took into account the number of farmers and bar owners who relied on the production and sale of alcohol to survive, and led them to bootlegging. This so-called compromise to give Americans back their legal alcohol rights was just a failed and resentful attempt to put an end to the violent crime in major cities and the corrupt enforcement of the amendment. With the economy now in shambles, prohibition had taken its toll and came to a close.